Hey everyone, you got Marcel, as promised, back again. At this point, a second video within a few days, I'm gonna ruin my reputation. I'm at risk of not being the snake that publishes once every 6 months. So for the topic today, I wanted to cover the validity of psychological therapy. That is therapy worth it? Should one go to therapy? And my opinions on therapy as a whole. Now, I'm referring to psychological therapy that someone would receive from like a counselor or a therapist, a psychologist, not going into the realm of heavy medications or very severe mental illnesses, things you'd see a psychiatrist for. That's a completely different field. Yeah, you gotta have a doctorate to hand out happy candy to people. Then I'll be going over my thoughts on how it is perceived within the medical field. Now, this is a little different than some of my regular topics, and I've got to put a disclaimer up front on this. In no ways does this video constitute any form of medical or psychological advice. If you or anyone you know is having difficulties psychologically or otherwise that have led to some kind of discomfort in your life, seek help. Find a solution. Go out and talk to a therapist. That's what they're there for. It's certainly not worth trying to hack something out on your own when there's professionals trained for that. For me, I only spent about a year diving into the field of psychology before I left it, which I'll get into why here in a minute, but that doesn't leave me in any position to be giving medical recommendations to people. So, having said all of that, we can get into the part that's my opinion and is intended as food for thought. So from my perspective, going to a psychologist is almost the equivalent of going to a mechanic. Allow me to explain. So the last time I actually went in to see a mechanic, one of my vehicles had stopped working properly. Now, my first response was to pop open the hood and look around a little bit, and I noticed that there was a hose that had been disconnected, a small one, vacuum line, to be specific. So I had a general idea of what was going on. Went into this mechanic and gave him an idea of where to look, what I thought the problem was, and left my vehicle with him. A couple of days later, went in to pick it up, and they had racked up about $400 on my bill. Now, naturally, I was a bit shocked. I told them where the problem was, a general idea of what the symptoms were. They should have known how to fix it, so where did all the money go? Oh, well, diagnosis, of course. They went and basically searched through the whole vehicle bumper to bumper to see exactly what the problem was. I told you where the problem was. It was right there. All you needed to do is basically go in and fix it. Oh, well, we really didn't know if that was actually the problem, and we wanted to be sure, so we went over everything. Now, for face value, that may have seemed like them taking better care of me, but with me knowing what was wrong, essentially, and just not being confident in fixing it, I had given them an opening to take advantage of me. What I was trying to do was simply pay them to solve a simple problem, not to diagnose in the first place, under the guise of looking out for me. And then furthermore, adding insult to injury, if I had done a little bit of searching on what was going on, I could have fixed it myself. Based on what I knew of the problem at the time, it would have basically been a $5 fix. I just needed to put the part in. Of course, that wouldn't have made them any money, so business isn't really handled that way. Now, comparing that to my experiences with therapy, dealing with problems when I was growing up, which was basically most of my experience with seeing therapists, was when I was young. Parents went through a divorce. School was having issues with students harassing me, pretty common stuff that people deal with. I just happened to be more vocal. So things that I thought were noteworthy, I would bring attention to, and that was what initially led me into getting quote-unquote help. For those who are wondering, sometimes when schools put students through therapy when they're dealing with things like that, it's not to help the student. It's actually to cover the school's ass, because they're worried if the student's getting harassed and it falls on them for liability that it happened and the student doesn't look bad, hey, if the student's been seeing therapists for a while, obviously the student just has problems. Of course, that was just my experience, but that has nothing to do with the motives or the goals of the therapist themselves. At least not necessarily. And that is not to say that I didn't want to learn how to handle my problems better, that being as even if the problems I were dealing with was caused by other people and not really within my control. Coping is a skill. you can learn these things. And even at a young age, I realized that. So I would go in to see this therapist, and I would know generally where the problem was. I would say, hey, this is my issue. How do I fix it? But rather than addressing that, they would go from one end of my mind all the way to the other and cover every single base along the step of the way. Things that could very likely be completely unrelated, just to cover all the bases of what might be causing my problem, as opposed to just addressing the issue itself. Has anyone else also noticed this, or was it just my experience? Because it's sounding eerily familiar to my experience with the mechanic. But hang in there, it actually gets worse. When you go into a mechanic with an issue, they're generally going to fix the problem. Well, they may charge you an arm and a leg for it, true, but you leave being able to have a functioning vehicle most of the time, right? They don't try and teach you how to drive it differently or more comfortably so you can cope with the fact that you got a busted transmission. Oh, here, try to shift differently or shift less. Maybe just drive less often so you can handle not having a functioning vehicle a little better. For my time, getting assistance with the things that I was dealing with did give me tools to cope with what I was having problems with. It didn't actually solve the problems. Now, of course, that could have to do with the nature of psychological disorders or difficulties in themselves, but honestly, and forgive me if I get into tinfoil hat territory here, is there any money in therapy that actually solves people's problems? If they were to hit a magic button that said you were fixed right after walking in the door, would they press it? Or would they take time diagnosing everything, talking about things, working through, and being sure to set up an appointment for next week? Now, I wholeheartedly believe that there are genuine, dedicated therapists out there, psychological professionals that have passion in their work and are devoted to helping people be stronger and more effective and essentially curing them when they walk out the door in a matter of minutes if possible. But who is more likely to be successful? The ones who prolong the condition and get repeat customers for doses of happiness while dealing with their problems, or for those who cure and don't ever see those customers again? Because odds are the ones that are more successful are going to be the ones you run into. They're going to be the ones with advertising, with reach, with the ability to bring in more customers. Looking back, in retrospect, all I needed growing up was a swift reality check to the back of the head. Hey Marcel, those are not your friends. Stop putting up with their shit, stand up for yourself, and don't be a pushover. Hindsight's always 20/20. But why the hell didn't anybody ever tell me that? They expect me to believe that all those trained professionals didn't have a clue what was actually going on for those years? It took me actually studying the field myself to figure out that very little of it was even caused by me. I'm a little more analytical than the average. Things that come to some as reflex have to be learned for me, and that sucks. It does put me at kind of a slower learning curve on social interactions. But it really doesn't put me at a lower scale than anyone. In fact, in a lot of cases, it put me at an advantage, but because I was different, of course, it put me in that category of different. Hey, this snake is noticing things. We gotta put him in a different room. Let's get him out away from other people. So taking the tinfoil hat off for a minute, the point I was trying to get at is that the solution isn't receiving therapy itself. The solution is the problem, or the lack of ability to cope with the problem, being completely fixed. It's circumstances where that goal isn't really ever addressed or guaranteed in any way that kind of piss me off. I mean, hell, even when you go in to see a lawyer before going to court or retaining them for something, you can write down a list of the problems that you want addressed and discussed, possibly even advice for, before you go in to do a consultation, right? That's a really useful tip, by the way. Write down the stuff you want to know for the consultation, because you pay money for that most of the time. That way you don't cough up the $100, $200, $300 or whatever it's going to cost for them to say, oh, just retain me and we'll talk about it. Granted, I know it really doesn't work that way with therapy. I can see somebody writing down on a paper, I want to know why my mom never loved me. before paying the receptionist. The point is that the quality of the therapist is determined by how much they're able to influence the solutions and the comfort of the person that's seeing them, not by making them permanently addicted to going into therapy. Now, I want to cover the other side of the spectrum on this. Referring to my vehicle, a vacuum hose is something I should have been able to handle, but I've also had a transmission go out. I lack the tools and the capabilities of being able to change something like that, and I would think the majority of people would say the same. Odds are, trying to fix it, I would probably do more damage to my vehicle than I would solve, if not getting completely crushed under a huge piece of aluminum. Psychological therapy has its merit, especially in helping people solve unusual problems that they aren't prepared for, designed to handle in normal circumstances, or even expected to happen in the first place. Not being able to handle my finances, for example, is something that I should psychologically be able to deal with. And seeing a therapist, let alone paying them for it, would be counterproductive. The equivalent of seeing the problem, knowing basically what it is, and yet still paying someone else to solve it for me. On the other side of things, having my entire life destroyed into shambles because of something terrible happening is an entirely different situation that I might not be prepared to fix, and getting advice to cope with it or to solve it is completely reasonable. The line one draws between what is a vacuum hose and what's a transmission is entirely relative. The point is taking the time to reflect and know the difference. So for those who are wondering, why is it that I, someone who takes an obvious passion in both helping people, giving advice, and talking about psychology in the first place, would get out of the field? It's kind of curious, right? There's two answers for that. The more relevant of which is that everything seems to want to be categorized. They want to put everyone into boxes as to what conditions they have, where they stand, what their problems are. An individual's mind has almost unlimited complexity, and considering that problems can overlap and cause unexpected or unusual side effects within someone's life, there is almost no way to categorically say that this person is a blank or has blank condition and be able to solve their problems with any level of certainty. It is equally possible that on an emotional or personality level, that two people, a random therapist and random person with problem, won't mesh. They're not going to get along. And despite how professional and knowledgeable and experienced and how good the advice is, for some people it's just not going to land. Even if everything they said was perfect, even if all of it was spot on, it might just not be a good mix. Furthermore, say for example, I just had a mind-blowing moment. I solved this person's problem. It just hit me as I was talking to them. And, instant solution, lightning in a bottle. How could I get that fix, that answer, to anyone else? Is the patient-client relationship laws going to prevent me from saying anything about the experience? Am I allowed to talk about it? I actually don't know. Maybe. I kind of doubt it. How do I reenact that situation to help the world? I'm sure having a dedicated time and a perfect solution for one person would cause ripples and would make a difference. But not being able to share that. Couple that with the further I got into the field, the more my knowledge increased, the more it became categorized and was less intuitive, less flexible. It actually started to bleed into my normal day. Like, does anybody have a friend who's a psychologist or a psychiatrist and they start to shrink you just as a friend? Don't you hate that? Not everything is a condition. And I started to see the world through that lens. It was really freaky. Odds are I could walk up to someone random, currently, and genuinely give them good advice that will help them with a problem. Maybe not perfect. It depends on what I've experienced before. But I bet at the least I could give them a useful outside perspective that might make a difference in their lives. Psychology training, at best, should be a tool that's meant to assist the psychologist, a guidebook, a direction they could look when seeing certain patterns in behavior. Tools for the toolbox, not labels for the people around them. Nobody wants a hammer glued to their forehead. In short, the ability to categorize people's complex problems became a crutch. Though granted, that may be entirely my perspective and not the case with anyone else in the field. Furthermore, there's a consideration of things like personal experience, culture, even gender, playing a role in the kind of advice and direction that a therapist would go with their advice. Generally, you would think the background of a therapist would be taken into account as to whether or not they're the best fit for a patient, and in some cases maybe it is. My experience is that they've been a one-size-fits-all solution for psychological problems, for the most part. It's a job. You get a customer, they pay, they leave. Though in practice it may not seem that heartless, in the reality of it tends to play out that way. Granted, of course, there are a lot of individuals that take a true passion in what they do. My reason for taking the path that I did isn't in the hopes that somewhere out there in cyberspace is the 1 in a million people that would actually be a good fit for the advice that I'm giving will stumble across it in their search for solutions and benefit from it, whereas the chances of them stumbling into my office would be insurmountably low. Then the final reason I didn't get into it professionally is I kept getting pushed into a marketing form of psychology, whereas I would be tailoring advertisements to psychologically twist people into wanting to buy the products that I was being paid to sell. Kind of subliminal advertising, if I said that right. I kind of thought of it as the perversion of the field, and it really disgusted me, so I walked away. Granted, nothing against people that do that. I'm sure there's a lot of money in it, at least that's what I was told. Keeping in mind, it's just my opinion. Now, for those of you steely-eyed individuals paying extra close to what I'm saying, maybe wanting to call me a hypocrite for saying on one hand that a therapist was wrong for trying to diagnose me from front to back instead of addressing the specific problem I came to them for, and then right after saying that the issue with therapy is they try to address specific issues without taking in the complexity of the individual they're working with, you're not wrong. That's a valid point. I recognize that that is close to contradictory. It's one of my issues with the field that there isn't really an easy solution. It should be based on the needs of the specific customer and what they're requesting in the first place. But how many people know what they need or even what they want? It was never my point to say whether or not psychology in of itself was right or wrong or good in the sense of offering assistance and therapy, but rather present the entire situation from a different perspective and offer food for thought for those considering whether or not they should receive it. I hope you all found that interesting. I certainly enjoy discussing things like this. Tell me what you think down below. Am I onto something? Am I completely full of shit? I want to hear it. If you want to hear more topics like this, share, like, subscribe. Until next time, this has been Marcel.